Picture this. Every single night of your entire life, you go to bed surrounded by your parents, your siblings, maybe a servant or two, possibly a farm animal on the other side of a thin wall. And that is just normal. That is Tuesday. And somehow, in the middle of all that, people still manage to have sex, raise children, and build civilizations. So how did they actually do it? Here's what this video is really about. For almost all of human history, the private bedroom didn't exist. Not just in the ancient world, we're talking right up to a few hundred years ago. And the story of how people navigated sex, intimacy, and even basic conversation without a door to close is genuinely one of the strangest chapters in human history. I've gone deep on the research, and I want to walk you through the most surprising parts. Because the last thing we get to is something so bizarre, it almost sounds made up. Let's start with something that reframes the entire question. There was no classical or medieval Latin word equivalent to privacy. The closest term, privatio, meant a taking away. Think about what that actually means. The Romans, who built aqueducts, codified law, ran an empire, had no word for the thing you consider a basic human right. And the majority of Romans lived in crowded apartments, with walls thin enough to hear every noise. So this wasn't a gap in their vocabulary because the concept was too obvious to name. It was a gap because the idea of a life separate from the group wasn't a category their world needed. Privacy, as we understand it, a door, a room, a moment that belongs only to you, that was not a thing that existed. And that matters, because the question isn't just, how did they find time alone? The question is, did they even want it? The answer, it turns out, is complicated. Cross-cultural data from tribal societies suggests that humans prefer to make love in solitude. In 9 out of 12 societies where homes have separate bedrooms for parents, people prefer to have sex indoors. In those cultures without homes with separate rooms, sex is more often preferred outdoors. But in practice, the need for survival often eclipses the desire for privacy. So here's what that actually tells us. The desire for privacy during sex isn't a modern invention. It looks like it might be a human constant. What changed over history wasn't the wanting, it was the invention of the tools to satisfy it. Ancient people weren't choosing communal exposure because they enjoyed an audience. They were choosing the least exposed available option, going outside in the dark, walking a little further from the fire. That was the workaround, and when there was no outside option, communal sleeping served overlapping functions, shared body heat, passive predator surveillance, and social reinforcement through proximity. Infants and children slept with adults. Co-sleeping was the default, not a parenting controversy. So kids weren't just occasionally nearby, they were always nearby. In studied hunter-gatherer and tribal societies, children commonly slept in the same hut or the same bed as their parents, which meant witnessing sex wasn't a scandal. It was just something that sometimes happened at night. And the solution wasn't architecture, it was a social script. In the Trobriand Islands, documented accounts describe parents taking no special precautions to shield children. If a child stirred, parents would simply scold them in the moment, tell them to pull a mat over their head and go back to sleep. Everyone already knew the script. The child knew it too. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, and this connects to something I'll come back to in a minute. In pre-industrial America and Europe, privacy was in short supply. Most people did everything under the gaze of others. They slept, ate, and attended to personal matters in the presence of family members, servants, and farm animals. And yet, inside all of that, people found a way to carve out something private. Private moments were snatched whenever and wherever they could be, and that often happened in bed. Away from the prying eyes of servants and neighbors, husbands and wives engaged in candid conversation. The bed acted as a kind of neutral territory between couples. Historians who've studied this period write that it was a place where women found rare moments of autonomy within the patriarchal household. So here's the reframe. The bed wasn't a place with no privacy. For most of human history, the shared marital bed was the most private space that existed. The darkness, the closeness, the fact that even servants weren't hovering right there, that was the room inside the room. Wives used it to say things they couldn't say anywhere else in the house. That's not zero privacy. That's privacy being invented in the only place it could fit. And the shared bed created other dynamics too. Male servants who shared a bed sometimes engaged in sexual relations, and it was not unusual for illegitimate babies to be conceived when male and female servants became bedmates. This wasn't a scandal that rocked households. It was a recognized, unremarkable social reality, just an accepted risk of communal living. People knew it happened. The household absorbed it. There were no private rooms to prevent it, so instead there were social norms to manage the aftermath. Now I want to flip the frame completely because everything we've talked about so far has been about people who had too little privacy. There's a group in history who went the other direction entirely. And what happened to them is genuinely unsettling. Some monastic communities practiced total solitary isolation as an act of devotion. Not communal living, the complete opposite. A single monk, a stone cell, no contact. And in at least one documented case on an island monastery, a monk who lived in total isolation died in his cell and wasn't discovered for 4 days. Nobody knew, nobody came. The community that communal sleeping had always provided, the accidental safety net of being surrounded by people, was gone. Zero privacy created friction and noise and awkward moments. But it also created a kind of passive security. Total isolation could mean dying alone and unnoticed. The ancient world, for all its lack of doors, had that going for it. And remember that thread I mentioned earlier, the one about how sleeping arrangements shaped some of the most intimate customs in history in ways almost nobody connects. Here it is. Anthropological research has found a documented statistical association between specific parent-child sleeping arrangements. For example, a mother and young son sharing a sleeping space while the father slept separately, and the likelihood that a society practiced male circumcision. The argument is that certain bodily customs, ones most people assume were driven by religion or hygiene, were actually shaped by the physical proximity of who slept next to whom. The architecture of sleep, or the lack of it, reached further into culture than we ever give it credit for. The Victorian home abounded with rooms and was divided into the realms of servants and masters. This marked a shift toward privacy that had been slowly taking place over the past 2 centuries. Individual bedrooms were assigned to each family member, and gradually the idea that communal sleeping was improper and downright immoral took hold. So the private bedroom isn't ancient. It isn't even that old. The roots of the twin bed trend for married couples can be traced back to the Victorian era, a time known for its strict moral codes and emphasis on propriety. And here's the gut punch ending that I promised at the start. Once people finally had private bedrooms, once the door existed, once the architecture of intimacy was finally in place, a significant portion of Western society decided to use it to sleep further apart. For almost a century between the 1850s and 1950s, separate beds were seen as a healthier, more modern option for couples than the double, with Victorian doctors warning that sharing a bed would allow the weaker sleeper to drain the vitality of the stronger. In the early decades of the 20th century, twin beds were indicative of forward-thinking married couples, balancing nocturnal togetherness with a continuing commitment to separateness and autonomy. Think about that arc. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans slept piled together out of necessity, for warmth, for safety, for survival. They wanted privacy and couldn't have it. Then slowly, architecture caught up. The private room arrived. And the first thing a chunk of society did with that hard-won privacy was use it to put more distance between married partners. The desire for closeness and the desire for space have been in tension the entire time. Ancient people didn't lack privacy because they were primitive. They lacked the tools. And the moment the tools arrived, some people immediately chose separation anyway. The backlash against twin beds as indicative of a distant or failing marriage intensified in the 1950s. And by the late 1960s, few married couples saw them as a desirable choice. The pendulum swung back. But the fact that it swung at all tells you something real about human nature, that we've never fully agreed on how close we want to be, even when we finally had the choice. So here's where we land. Ancient humans didn't have a word for privacy because the concept of a life separate from the group wasn't something their world had room for. Literally. The desire for intimate privacy appears to be deeply human and cross-cultural, but for most of history, the best available option was a mat over a child's head or a walk into the dark. The shared bed, far from being a place of zero privacy, was actually the most private space most people ever had. And the private bedroom, the thing we now treat as a basic feature of adult life, is younger than most people assume. And the moment it arrived, some people used it to sleep further apart on purpose. If this kind of history genuinely surprised you, drop a comment below with the thing that hit hardest. I read every single one, and it helps me figure out what to make next. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, the next video is right there. It covers another piece of everyday life that turns out to be completely different from what you were taught. You won't want to skip it.